What I'm about to tell you will shatter everything you think you know about those lonely highways stretching across America. These aren't urban legends or campfire stories passed down through generations of truckers. These are 11 documented encounters that happened to real drivers. Men and women who swear on their lives that what they experience defies every law of physics and reality we hold sacred. One driver picked up a hitchhiker who vanished from a locked cab, leaving behind only a wallet with an ID dated 50 years in the past. Another received turn-by-turn directions over his CB radio from someone who had been dead for 2 decades. The most bone-chilling account comes from a veteran trucker who delivered cargo to a building that had been demolished before he was even born. And the security footage shows him unloading his trailer completely alone, talking to shadows that weren't there. I'm Horror Whispers. And if you think you can handle the truth about what lurks on America's darkest roads, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear will make you question whether you're truly alone when you drive at night. My name is Dave Morrison, and I've been hauling freight across this country for 23 years. I've seen everything from blizzards that'll freeze your soul to desert heat that melts the asphalt beneath your tires. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on Interstate 15 through the Montana Mountain Pass last winter. It was February, around 2 in the morning, and I was running behind schedule with a load of electronics heading to Seattle. The weather had turned nasty about 50 miles back, with snow coming down so thick my headlights barely cut through it. The road was getting slick, and I was white-knuckling the steering wheel trying to keep my 18-wheeler from sliding off into the canyon below. That's when my CB radio crackled to life. "Eastbound Kenworth, this is Mountain Guardian. You're about to hit some black ice around mile marker 247. Better slow her down." I grabbed the mic, grateful for the heads up. "Thanks for the warning, Mountain Guardian. This is Big Dave in the blue Kenworth. Appreciate you looking out." "No problem, Big Dave. Been watching you struggle back there for a while now. Road gets real nasty just ahead. You might want to take the next exit and wait it out." Something about his voice bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on it. It had this hollow quality, like he was talking from the bottom of a well. But hell, CB radios aren't known for crystal clear audio, especially in weather like this. I slowed down just like he suggested, and sure enough, there was a patch of ice that would have sent me straight into the guardrail. "Damn, Mountain Guardian, you saved my bacon there. How'd you know about that ice?" "Been driving these roads longer than you've been alive, son. Know every dangerous curve and hidden hazard. There's construction ahead at mile marker 251. Entire right lane is closed, but they didn't put up proper signs. Stay left." I followed his advice again, and just like he said, there was construction equipment sitting right in the middle of the right lane with no warning whatsoever. Would have plowed right into a bulldozer if he hadn't warned me. This guy was like some kind of guardian angel, keeping me safe through the worst mountain pass I'd ever driven. For the next 3 hours, Mountain Guardian stayed on the radio with me. He knew exactly when to warn me about fallen rocks, where the wind would try to push my trailer sideways, and which curves had the worst ice buildup. We talked about everything: the trucking industry, how it had changed over the years, routes we'd driven. He told me about hauling lumber through these same mountains back in the 70s before they widened the road and put in the modern guardrails. Those were different times, Big Dave. We didn't have GPS or cell phones, just had to know the roads by heart and trust your instincts. Lost a lot of good drivers in these mountains back then. His voice was getting clearer somehow, more personal. That's when he started saying things that made my blood run cold. "You've got a picture of your daughter Sarah taped to your dashboard, don't you? The one where she's wearing that yellow dress at her high school graduation?" I nearly swerved off the road. I did have that exact picture, but there was no way he could see it from wherever he was broadcasting. How do you know about that? And that scar on your left hand from when you caught it in a trailer door back in '98. Still gives you trouble in cold weather, doesn't it? My hand was throbbing at that very moment, but I'd never mentioned the injury to anyone over the CB. My mouth went dry. Mountain Guardian, where exactly are you broadcasting from? Same place I've been broadcasting from for 43 years, Big Dave. Mile marker 238, where my rig went through the guardrail during a storm just like this one, February 15th, 1981. The radio went dead silent except for static. I grabbed my logbook and checked the date, February 15th, 2024. Exactly 43 years later. As dawn broke and the snow finally stopped, I pulled over at the first truck stop to gather my nerves. I asked the clerk about any accidents in the area, and she told me about a trucker named Jake Morrison who died in 1981 when his rig slid off the mountain during a blizzard. They'd found his CB still transmitting for hours after the crash, like he was trying to warn other drivers. Morrison. Same last name as mine. When I got home, I called my mother and asked about family history. Turns out Jake Morrison was my father's older brother. The uncle I'd never met because he died before I was born. The uncle who'd been a trucker and had planned to teach me about the roads when I got older. I drove that route again last month. My CB stayed silent the entire trip, but I keep it tuned to Channel 19 just in case Mountain Guardian needs to help another driver find their way home safely through the dark. I'm Tommy Rodriguez, and I've been hauling cargo across the western states for 12 years. What I'm about to tell you happened on Highway 50 through Nevada, on what they call the loneliest road in America. Now I know why they call it that, and it has nothing to do with the lack of towns. It was early September, around 3 in the morning, and I was pushing hard to make a delivery deadline in Reno. The desert highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, nothing but sagebrush and darkness on both sides. That's when I first noticed the truck in my mirrors. At first I thought it was just another driver running the same route. The headlights appeared in my passenger side mirror, keeping pace about a quarter-mile back. Nothing unusual about that. Truckers often end up traveling together on these long stretches, especially at night. But after an hour, I realized something was wrong. The truck was matching my speed exactly, staying at precisely the same distance. I decided to test it. I slowed down from 70 to 65 miles per hour. The lights in my mirror slowed down too, maintaining that exact quarter-mile gap. I sped up to 75. The lights sped up. I hit my brakes suddenly, dropping to 50. The mirror truck dropped to 50 and held position. When I looked directly behind me through my rear window, I saw nothing but empty highway. But the moment I looked back at my mirrors, there it was. A truck identical to mine. Same blue Peterbilt cab, same white trailer, even the same company logos on the side. It was like looking at a reflection, except the mirror truck was behind me instead of beside me. I grabbed my CB radio and tried to make contact. Eastbound Peterbilt, this is the blue Pete about a quarter-mile ahead of you. Come back. Nothing but static. I tried different channels, but no response. The truck just kept following, perfectly mirroring every move I made. Around mile marker 127, I decided to pull over at a rest area to see what would happen. As I slowed and put on my turn signal, the mirror truck did the same. I pulled into the parking area and stopped. Through my mirrors, I watched the other truck pull in behind me and park in the exact same position, like a perfect reflection. But when I got out of my cab to confront whoever was playing this sick game, the parking area was completely empty. My truck sat alone under the dim light of a single lamppost. No other vehicles anywhere. I walked around my rig twice, checking every angle, but I was definitely alone. Back in my cab, I looked at my mirrors again. The truck was there, parked right behind me, engine running. I could see exhaust coming from its stack, could see the running lights glowing. but direct observation showed nothing. I started my engine and pulled back onto the highway, and sure enough, the mirror truck followed. It stayed with me for the next 4 hours, through every curve, over every hill, matching my exact speed and movements. Whenever I checked my mirrors, it was there. Whenever I looked directly, the road was empty. The strangest part happened just before dawn. I had been fighting to stay awake, and in my exhaustion, I started talking to the mirror truck like it was a real person. "You getting tired back there, buddy? This run's been a long one." And I swear, for just a moment, I saw the driver wave at me in the mirror. Same trucker cap I was wearing, same build, same everything. As the sun came up and the desert landscape became visible, the mirror truck began to fade. By full daylight, it was gone completely, and it never appeared again on that trip. I've driven that route dozens of times since then, and I've never seen the mirror truck again. But I've heard other drivers talking on the CB about seeing identical rigs following them through Nevada. They described the same thing: perfect mimicry, visible only in mirrors, always staying exactly a quarter-mile back. I think something in that desert reflects more than just light. Maybe it's the isolation, the endless emptiness that makes reality bend in on itself. Or maybe there are things out there that mirror our movements, our lives, showing us what we might become if we drive those lonely roads long enough. All I know is that for one night I wasn't alone on the loneliest road in America. And somehow that was more terrifying than being alone ever could be. My name is Frank Muller, and I've been driving trucks for 34 years. In all that time, I've learned that mechanical problems always happen at the worst possible moments, in the most inconvenient places. But what happened to me on a back road in Kentucky last spring was more than just inconvenient. It was impossible. I was running behind schedule with a load of furniture heading to Nashville when my engine started making a noise I'd never heard before. A deep, grinding sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My temperature gauge was climbing toward the red zone, and I could smell burning oil. I knew I had to find help fast, or I'd be looking at a complete engine rebuild. The problem was my location. I'd taken a shortcut through rural Kentucky to make up time, following a winding 2-lane road through hills and farmland. My GPS showed the nearest truck stop was 40 miles away, and I wasn't sure my engine would last another mile. That's when I saw the sign. Mueller's Garage, all repairs, 2 miles. The coincidence of the name didn't strike me as strange at first. Muller is a common enough surname, especially in areas with German heritage. I was just grateful to find any repair shop in such a remote location. I limped my truck along the narrow road until I found the garage, a small, older building with a hand-painted sign and a single bay large enough for trucks. An elderly man came out to meet me as I pulled into the gravel lot. He was wearing clean coveralls and a baseball cap, probably in his 70s, but moving with the confident ease of someone who'd been working on vehicles his entire life. He introduced himself as Frank Mueller, and the coincidence of our shared first name made us both chuckle. "What seems to be the trouble, Frank?" he asked, and I explained the symptoms I'd been experiencing. He listened carefully, nodding at the right moments, asking technical questions that showed he knew truck engines inside and out. Within minutes, he diagnosed the problem as a catastrophic failure in my water pump, combined with a blown head gasket. "That's going to be expensive," I said, already calculating the cost of parts, labor, and the delay in my delivery schedule. But Frank just shook his head and smiled. "Don't worry about it. I've got the parts you need right here in the shop. Won't take more than a couple hours to fix you up." He quoted me a price that was less than half what I'd expected to pay, and he assured me he could have me back on the road before dark. I followed him into his shop, and that's when I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. His equipment was old but immaculate. tools from the 1960s and 70s that looked like they'd been maintained perfectly but hardly used. His parts inventory was extensive, with components for truck models spanning decades, all organized with military precision. Frank worked on my engine with an expertise I'd rarely seen. He seemed to know exactly what needed to be done without having to reference any manuals or diagnostic equipment. His hands moved with practiced confidence, and he completed repairs that should have taken hours in what felt like minutes. Throughout the work, he told me stories about the trucking industry, about routes and drivers he'd known over the years. "Been working on trucks in this area for 43 years, he said as he installed the new water pump. "Seen a lot of drivers come through here, folks who needed help getting back on the road. It's good work, helping people when they're stranded." When he finished the repairs, my engine ran better than it had in months. The grinding noise was gone, the temperature gauge read normal, and all my fluid levels were perfect. I offered to pay him immediately, but he waved me off. "Just pass it along," he said. "Help another driver when you get the chance. That's how we take care of each other out here." I thanked him profusely and got back on the road, making my delivery to Nashville with time to spare. It wasn't until I was filling out my logbook that night that I realized I'd forgotten to get a receipt for the repairs. My company would need documentation for the expense report, so I decided to call the garage the next morning. When I tried to find a phone number for Meller's Garage, I couldn't locate any business listings for that area of Kentucky. I called information, searched online directories, even contacted the local Chamber of Commerce. No one had any record of a garage by that name on the road where I'd found it. Curious and slightly concerned, I drove back to that location on my next run through Kentucky 2 weeks later. The garage was gone. Not closed, not abandoned. Gone. There was nothing but an empty field where the building had stood with no foundation, no concrete pad. No sign that any structure had ever existed there. I asked at a gas station in the nearest town about Miller's Garage, and the elderly attendant gave me a strange look. "Frank Muller's place burned down in 1981, he said. "Nice old fellow, helped a lot of truckers over the years. Died in the fire trying to save his equipment. Real shame. He was the best mechanic in 3 counties. The attendant described Frank Muller perfectly. The same age, the same appearance, even the same coveralls and baseball cap. According to local records, Frank had been helping stranded truckers for over 40 years when he died, and dozens of drivers had attended his funeral to pay their respects. I've driven past that empty field many times since then, always slowing down to look for any sign of the garage that saved my trip that day. I've never seen it again, but I've heard other drivers talking on the CB about finding help in impossible places, about mechanics who appear when you need them most and disappear before you can properly thank them. I keep Frank's advice in mind wherever I go. I help other drivers when I can, whether it's sharing information about road conditions, offering assistance with mechanical problems, or just providing a friendly voice on the radio during long, lonely nights. Maybe that's how it works. Maybe Frank is still out there helping truckers, and maybe all of us who've been helped are carrying on his work, passing along kindness to drivers who need it most. Some people might say I hallucinated the whole thing, that stress and fatigue made me imagine a garage that doesn't exist. But my engine still runs perfectly, exactly the way Frank fixed it that day. Whatever happened in that empty field in Kentucky, whether it was supernatural or just the mysterious way the universe sometimes provides help when you need it most, I'm grateful for it. And I'll keep passing it along just like Frank asked me to. My name is Michael Torres, and I've been driving trucks for 28 years. I thought I'd seen every kind of freight, delivered to every type of location, dealt with every possible complication that could arise in this business. But my final delivery, and I mean that literally, was something that defied everything I understood about logistics, geography, and the basic laws of reality. It started with a rush order that came in on a Friday afternoon in March. The dispatcher called me directly, which was unusual, telling me about an urgent delivery that needed to reach Detroit by Monday morning. The pay was exceptional, triple my normal rate, and the cargo was listed simply as industrial components, with a weight that would put me right at legal limits. The pickup location was a warehouse facility I'd never seen before, despite 28 years of running freight in and out of the industrial district. The address led me to a building that looked older than the surrounding structures, with architecture that seemed to belong to a different era. The loading crew worked with unusual efficiency, sealing my trailer with locks I didn't recognize and handing me paperwork that felt strange under my fingers. Too thick, too smooth, like it was made from material that wasn't quite paper. The delivery address in Detroit was specific down to the suite number. 1247 Industrial Boulevard, Suite 2055. The building was supposed to be a manufacturing facility that specialized in precision machining, according to my manifest. I programmed the address into my GPS and started the long drive north, expecting a routine weekend haul despite the unusual circumstances surrounding the pickup. Everything seemed normal for the first several hours. I made good time through Tennessee and Kentucky, stopped for fuel and food at familiar truck stops, chatted with other drivers on the CB. But somewhere around Cincinnati, I started noticing that my GPS was taking me on routes that didn't match the roads I was actually driving. The GPS showed me traveling on Interstate 75, but the highway signs I was passing indicated I was on Interstate 71. When I recalculated the route, the GPS insisted I was on the correct path and adjusted the map to match what I was seeing, but the destination remained the same. 1247 Industrial Boulevard, Detroit, arriving Monday morning at 8 a.m. The discrepancies got worse as I continued north. My GPS showed me driving through Toledo, but the city signs indicated I was passing through areas with names I'd never heard of. Millbrook Junction, Riverside Industrial, New Canton. The exits didn't match any road atlas I'd ever used, and when I tried to call my dispatcher to report the navigation problems, my phone showed no signal despite being in areas that should have had full coverage. I pulled into a truck stop around midnight to rest and figure out what was going wrong with my route. The truck stop looked normal enough. Fuel pumps, restaurant, parking area full of other semis. But when I tried to pay for fuel, the attendant asked for payment in cash that looked slightly different from normal currency. These bills were the right size and color, but the serial numbers were formatted strangely, and the dates on the bills were from 2089. The attendant accepted the money without comment, gave me change in the same unusual currency, and acted like nothing was out of the ordinary. Other truckers in the restaurant were having normal conversations about freight rates, road conditions, and delivery schedules, but their CB radios were picking up traffic reports for highways that didn't exist in any state I'd ever driven through. Back on the road, I followed my GPS through the night, driving through landscapes that looked almost familiar but subtly wrong. The cities were too large or too small. The highway interchanges were more complex than they should have been, and the industrial areas seemed to stretch endlessly without the residential neighborhoods that should have broken them up. I reached Detroit just as the sun was rising, and my GPS guided me to 1247 Industrial Boulevard. The building was there exactly as described in my manifest. A large manufacturing facility with loading docks and the suite number clearly marked. But when I looked around the surrounding area, I realized I wasn't in the Detroit I knew. The skyline was different, with buildings that were too tall and architectural styles that seemed to blend different eras. The receiving crew at Suite 2055 was waiting for me, professional and efficient. They unloaded my trailer quickly, inspected the cargo, and had me sign delivery confirmation paperwork. The supervisor handed me an envelope with my payment. Cash in those same strangely dated bills, exactly the amount I'd been promised plus a substantial bonus for on-time delivery. "Thanks for the reliable service, Mr. Torres," the supervisor said as I prepared to leave. "We'll definitely use your services again when we need transportation to this timeline." I asked him what he meant by timeline, but he just smiled and pointed toward the exit. "Your GPS will guide you back to your normal routes. Drive safely, and remember that some deliveries are more important than they appear to be." The return trip was immediate and disorienting. One moment I was leaving the loading dock in this strange version of Detroit, and the next moment I was pulling into a truck stop in Kentucky that I recognized from my northbound trip. My GPS showed normal highways, normal cities, normal everything. The cash in my envelope had changed to regular currency, but it was still the full amount I'd been promised. When I got home, I tried to research the company that had hired me for the delivery. The pickup address in my home city led to an empty lot that had been vacant for years. The Detroit address existed, but it was a small office building with no manufacturing facilities, no loading docks, and no Suite 2055. My logbook recorded the entire trip normally: pickup time, driving hours, delivery confirmation, but according to my electronic logging device, I'd driven 847 miles in a single direction, delivered my cargo, and returned home without the return trip registering any miles or time. The system showed me arriving at my destination and immediately appearing back home, as if the return journey had happened instantaneously. I kept the unusual currency as a reminder of the strangest delivery I'd ever made, but within a week those bills had faded and crumbled to dust, leaving only normal money in my wallet. The delivery confirmation paperwork dissolved in the same way until all I had left was the memory of driving through a version of America that existed somewhere parallel to the one I knew. I never got another call for that type of special delivery. But I sometimes wonder if there are other drivers out there carrying cargo between different versions of reality, making deliveries to places that exist just slightly to the left or right of the world we think we know. Maybe the highways we drive every day connect more than just cities and states. Maybe they connect different possibilities, different timelines, different versions of the same world. After 28 years of driving, I thought I knew every road in America. But that final delivery taught me that there are always more roads to discover, more destinations to reach, more versions of home to find. The question isn't whether those other timelines exist. It's whether we're brave enough to deliver to them when they call. My name is James Crawford, and I've been driving trucks across this country for 31 years. I've seen highways built, watched truck stops close, observed entire industries change as technology and economics shifted the landscape of American freight transport. I thought I understood the rhythm of the road, the predictable cycle of routes and destinations that define a trucker's life. But what happened at the Riverside Truck Plaza in eastern Wyoming last winter taught me that some places exist outside normal time, and some stops on our routes connect us to journeys we haven't taken yet. I was running a load of electronics from Salt Lake City to Omaha, taking Interstate 80 through the familiar stretch of Wyoming high desert. It was late January with temperatures well below zero and wind that cut through even the best winter gear. Around 11 at night, I was getting low on fuel and looking forward to a hot meal and maybe a shower at the next truck stop. The Riverside Truck Plaza appeared exactly where my GPS indicated it should be, a well-lit oasis in the frozen darkness. The parking lot was full of semis, the restaurant looked warm and inviting, and the fuel pumps were modern and well-maintained. I'd stopped there dozens of times over the years, and it always provided reliable service and decent food. But as I pulled into the fuel island, I noticed something strange about the other trucks in the lot. They looked different, not dramatically different, but subtly wrong in ways that were hard to identify. The designs were sleeker, more aerodynamic, with features I didn't recognize. The trailers had logos for companies I'd never heard of, and the license plates had formatting that didn't match any state system I knew. I fueled up normally, but when I went inside to pay, the building layout was different from what I remembered. The restaurant was larger, the gift shop carried merchandise with unfamiliar branding, and the employees were wearing uniforms with a truck stop logo I'd never seen before. Even the cash register was different, more advanced, with a digital display that showed information in formats I didn't recognize. The cashier was friendly enough, processing my fuel payment without any problems. But when I asked about the changes to the facility, she looked confused. Changes? We haven't made any changes. Everything's been the same for years. I ordered coffee and a sandwich from the restaurant, trying to figure out why everything felt familiar yet wrong. The menu items were similar to what I expected, but the prices were different. Not just higher or lower, but displayed in a currency format that looked almost right but included symbols I didn't understand. While I was eating, I listened to conversations from other truckers in the restaurant. They were discussing freight rates, delivery schedules, and road conditions, all normal topics. But they mentioned cities I'd never heard of, referred to highways with numbers that didn't exist, and talked about technologies that seemed more advanced than anything I'd seen in the trucking industry. One driver was complaining about a delay caused by atmospheric interference with the navigation grid, while another was discussing cargo authentication protocols that required biometric verification at every delivery point. Their conversation sounded like trucking, but trucking from a world that had developed differently from the one I knew. I decided to check my CB radio to see if I could pick up any normal chatter from drivers I recognized. The radio worked, but all the conversations I heard matched what I was listening to in the restaurant. References to unfamiliar places, technologies, and procedures that seemed to belong to a more advanced version of the trucking industry. When I went back to my truck, I found a receipt for my fuel purchase tucked under my windshield wiper. The receipt showed the correct amount for my fuel, but it was dated February 15th, 2031, 7 years in the future. The truck stop name on the receipt was Riverside Trans-Temporal Plaza, not the Riverside Truck Plaza I remembered. I checked my watch, my phone, my truck's computer systems. Everything showed the correct current date in 2024. But the receipt insisted it was 2031, and all the strange details I'd noticed suddenly made sense. Somehow I'd stopped at a version of the truck stop that existed 7 years in the future. I started my truck and pulled back onto Interstate 80, eager to get back to familiar territory. But as I merged onto the highway, I realized the road itself was different. The asphalt was smoother, the lane markings were more sophisticated, and there were electronic signs displaying traffic information in formats I'd never seen before. My GPS showed the correct route to Omaha, but it was displaying additional information, real-time weather data, traffic predictions, and routing suggestions that seemed far more advanced than current technology. When I tried to contact dispatch on my satellite phone, I got a recording saying the number had been discontinued due to communication protocol updates. For the next 2 hours, I drove through a version of Wyoming that was almost identical to the Wyoming I knew, but with subtle differences that indicated technological advancement. Rest areas had charging stations for electric vehicles, highway signs included information displayed in multiple languages, and other trucks on the road looked like evolved versions of current designs. Around 1 in the morning, I saw another truck stop ahead, the familiar Golden Eagle Travel Center where I'd stopped many times before. As I pulled into the parking lot, everything snapped back to normal. The trucks looked familiar, the building appeared exactly as I remembered it, and when I checked inside, the prices, layout, and equipment were all current and recognizable. The cashier at Golden Eagle looked at my fuel receipt from Riverside and frowned. "This receipt format is weird. I've never seen a truck stop receipt that looks like this." The date on the receipt had changed to the correct current date, but the trans-temporal designation was still visible in faded text. I completed my delivery to Omaha without further incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about those 2 hours I'd spent driving through 2031. When I researched the Riverside Truck Plaza later, I found that the facility was scheduled for major renovations that would begin in 2027 and include exactly the technological upgrades I'd observed: advanced fuel systems, expanded restaurant facilities, and integration with next-generation transportation networks. I've stopped at Riverside many times since then, always during daylight hours, always making sure my watch and phone show normal dates before I enter the building. The truck stop looks exactly like it did before my strange experience, with no sign of the advanced features I observed during my night in 2031. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night through that stretch of Wyoming, I wonder if there are other truck stops out there that exist in different times, serving drivers from past and future decades who need fuel, food, and rest on journeys that span more than just geographic distance. Maybe the highways we travel connect not only different places but different times, and maybe some destinations exist in the spaces between when we are and when we're going to be. The receipt from my future fuel stop finally crumbled to dust after several months, leaving no physical evidence of my temporal detour. But I kept the memory, and I've learned to pay closer attention to the details of familiar places, watching for signs that I might have slipped sideways through time into a version of the road that hasn't happened yet, or maybe one that happened long ago when different drivers were making different deliveries to destinations that exist only in the margins of possibility. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I've been an owner-operator for 19 years, running my own routes and managing my own schedule across the eastern seaboard. I've always prided myself on maintaining direct relationships with my customers, avoiding the bureaucracy and miscommunication that comes with large dispatch operations. But during a particularly difficult period last spring when regular work was scarce, I started taking assignments from a dispatch service I'd never used before, and that decision led me into the most unsettling experience of my entire trucking career. The company was called Nightline Logistics, and they specialized in overnight freight that needed to move quickly and quietly between major metropolitan areas. Their rates were excellent. Their loads were always legal and properly documented, and they seemed to have an endless supply of urgent shipments that needed experienced drivers who could work independently without constant supervision. My contact at Nightline was a dispatcher named Helen Morrison, who worked the midnight shift and handled assignments for drivers like me who preferred running at night when traffic was light and roads were clear. Helen had a distinctive voice, gravelly from years of cigarettes but warm and professional, with the kind of maternal concern that made you feel like she genuinely cared about getting you home safely. Over the course of 3 months, Helen assigned me dozens of loads, and every single assignment went perfectly. She knew exactly which routes to avoid due to construction, which way stations would be operating during overnight hours, and which customers paid quickly without hassling drivers about minor paperwork discrepancies. Her information was always accurate, her routing suggestions always optimal, and her predictions about delivery schedules were uncannily precise. Helen and I developed the kind of professional relationship that's rare in the trucking industry. She would call me personally with load offers, remember details about my truck's capabilities and my preferred operating areas, and even check in during long hauls to make sure I wasn't having mechanical problems or getting too fatigued. She knew my wife's name, remembered my daughter's birthday, and always asked about my plans for holidays and time off. The Strange part was that I only ever talked to Helen between midnight and 6 in the morning. If I tried calling Nightline Logistics during normal business hours, I always got a recorded message saying the dispatch office was temporarily unavailable, and my calls were never returned until Helen contacted me the following night. When I asked her about this, she explained that Nightline's overnight operation was completely separate from their day services, with different personnel and different customer bases. In early June, I was running a load from Baltimore to Atlanta when Helen called around 2 in the morning with an urgent pickup request. A customer in Richmond needed emergency transport of medical equipment to a hospital in Charlotte, and they were willing to pay premium rates for immediate service. Helen provided detailed directions to the pickup location, contact information for the customer, and routing instructions that would get me to Charlotte by dawn. The pickup went smoothly, and I was making excellent time toward Charlotte when Helen called again around 4:30. "Marcus, I need to warn you about a situation developing on your route. There's been a multi-vehicle accident on Interstate 85 just south of Durham. Highway Patrol is diverting all commercial traffic to alternate routes, but I've got a way to get you around the backup." Helen guided me through a series of state highways that bypassed the accident area completely, saving me at least 2 hours of delay. Her routing was perfect, her information was current, and I arrived in Charlotte right on schedule. When I thanked her for the excellent traffic intelligence, she just laughed and said that good dispatchers always know what's happening on their drivers' routes. But when I checked the news later that morning, I couldn't find any reports of a major accident on Interstate 85 near Durham. Traffic websites showed no recent incidents. Highway Patrol logs indicated normal overnight conditions, and when I called a friend who drives that route regularly, he said he'd been through the area around 5 a.m. without seeing any problems. I started paying closer attention to Helen's traffic advisories and route modifications. Over the next few weeks, she warned me about accidents that news reports never mentioned, guided me around construction projects that didn't appear on any official highway department websites, and provided real-time weather information that was consistently more accurate than anything I could get from meteorological services. The most disturbing realization came in early July when Helen called with a rush assignment that required pickup in Norfolk and delivery to Jacksonville. She provided her usual detailed briefing about route conditions, fuel stops, and timing requirements. But during our conversation, she mentioned a conversation we'd had last Tuesday about truck maintenance issues. I hadn't talked to Helen the previous Tuesday. I'd been home for 3 days with a family emergency, and I hadn't taken any loads or spoken to any dispatchers during that period. When I pointed this out, Helen paused for a long moment, then said, "Oh, that's right. Sometimes these overnight shifts run together. Sorry about the confusion, Marcus." But the confusion bothered me, especially when Helen continued referencing conversations and events that hadn't happened. She would ask about loads I hadn't transported, mention customers I'd never worked with, and provide updates on situations I had no knowledge of. It was as if she were tracking a version of my career that existed parallel to my actual experiences. The final straw came in late July when Helen called with what she described as a continuation load, picking up cargo I'd supposedly delivered the previous week and transporting it to a new destination. She provided detailed information about the cargo, the previous delivery, and the reasons for the additional transport. But I had no memory of the original delivery, no record of the customer in my logbooks, and no documentation of any payment for services I supposedly provided. When I told Helen I had no record of the previous load, her voice changed. The warm, maternal tone disappeared, replaced by something colder, more mechanical. "Marcus, you transported 17 pallets of industrial equipment from Phoenix Metalworks to Carolina Manufacturing on July 18th. Delivery was completed at 14:30, signed for by Supervisor Janet Walsh, payment processed through standard invoicing. This is a continuation of that shipment. I had been home on July 18th celebrating my daughter's birthday. I had photographs, receipts from the restaurant, witness testimony from family members. But Helen insisted I had made the delivery and she had detailed records of the entire transaction. That's when I realized Helen wasn't just dispatching loads for me. She was dispatching loads for multiple versions of me, tracking careers and experiences that belonged to different Marcus Thompsons in different timelines. Maybe there was a Marcus Thompson who had delivered that Phoenix Metalworks load, but it wasn't me. I stopped taking assignments from Nightline Logistics after that conversation, but Helen continued calling for several weeks, offering loads that sounded increasingly disconnected from reality. She would reference customers that didn't exist, routes that led to nowhere, and cargo that defied physical laws. Her voice became more distorted with each call, less human and more like an audio recording that was degrading with repeated playback. The final call came in early August. Helen's voice was barely recognizable, full of static and electronic distortion. "Marcus, I have your final assignment. Pick up at the Nightline terminal, no address specified. Cargo manifest lists, unresolved deliveries for transport to previous destinations. No deadline, no delivery requirements, no return expected." I hung up without responding, and Helen never called again. When I tried to research Nightline Logistics, I found no business registration, no DOT authority numbers, no physical address, no record that the company had ever existed. My bank records showed payments from Nightline for the loads I'd transported, but the routing numbers led to accounts that had been closed for years. I still drive overnight routes, but I work exclusively with established companies now. Dispatchers I can meet face to face, operations that exist in normal business reality. Sometimes late at night when my radio crackles with static, I wonder if Helen is still out there somewhere, dispatching phantom loads to drivers who exist in the spaces between what happened and what might have happened. Coordinating shipments that connect different versions of the same world through the endless network of highways that bind together all the possible journeys we might have taken. My name is Lisa Chen, and I've been driving long haul for 15 years, specializing in cross-country routes that take me through some of the most remote areas of the American West. I'm used to long stretches of highway where radio signals fade to static and cell towers are hundreds of miles apart, where the only company you have is your own thoughts and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the horizon. But what happened during a run through Nevada last September made me realize that sometimes the emptiest places are filled with voices that shouldn't exist, broadcasting messages that were never meant to be heard. I was hauling computer equipment from San Francisco to Denver, taking Highway 50 through the heart of Nevada, the stretch they call the loneliest road in America. It was around 3 in the morning and I'd been driving for 6 hours through absolute darkness, nothing visible beyond my headlights except sagebrush and the occasional road sign marking distances to towns that were little more than gas stations and convenience stores. My AM radio had been picking up nothing but static for the past hour when suddenly a clear signal broke through, so loud and distinct that it made me jump. It was an emergency alert system broadcast, the familiar monotone voice that announces severe weather warnings and other emergency information. But this broadcast was different from any EAS message I'd ever heard. "This is an emergency alert for all drivers currently traveling on Highway 50 between mile markers 127 and 184. A severe atmospheric disturbance is affecting the area, causing temporal displacement and reality distortion. All vehicles should immediately exit the highway and seek shelter until conditions normalize. Do not attempt to continue travel through the affected zone. This is not a test." The broadcast repeated 3 times, then faded back to static. I checked my location. I was at mile marker 156, right in the middle of the zone mentioned in the alert. But there were no visible weather problems, no emergency vehicles, no signs of any atmospheric disturbance. The night was clear, with stars visible in every direction and no wind to speak of. I tried switching to other radio stations to get more information, but every frequency was either dead air or picking up the same emergency broadcast on a loop. My CB radio was silent except for occasional bursts of static that almost sounded like voices speaking too quickly to understand. Even my satellite phone showed no signal, which was impossible in such an open area. The smart thing would have been to follow the broadcast's instructions and find an exit. But the nearest town was 30 miles away, and I had a tight delivery schedule to maintain. I decided to keep driving, figuring that if there was a real emergency, I'd see evidence of it soon enough. That's when I started noticing other vehicles on the highway. At first, it was just occasional headlights in my mirrors or approaching from the opposite direction. Nothing unusual for a major highway, even in a remote area. But as I continued driving, the traffic increased dramatically. Soon there were dozens of vehicles visible in both directions, all traveling at normal speeds, all appearing to be ordinary cars and trucks. The strange part was that none of these vehicles seemed to acknowledge each other's existence. Cars would pass through the same space occupied by trucks, headlights would shine through solid trailers, and vehicles would merge into lanes already occupied by other traffic. It was like watching multiple movies projected onto the same screen, each one completely separate from the others. My radio continued broadcasting the emergency alert every few minutes, but now it was accompanied by other announcements that made no sense. Traffic reports for highways that didn't exist, weather forecasts for cities I'd never heard of, and news updates about events that sounded like they were happening in a different world entirely. Highway 50 eastbound traffic is experiencing delays due to the temporal convergence at mile marker 163. Drivers are advised to maintain current speed and avoid sudden lane changes while passing through overlapping timeline zones. Emergency crews are standing by to assist any vehicles that become displaced from their original temporal trajectory. I was approaching mile marker 163 when I saw something that made me slow down despite the traffic report's advice. There was a massive pileup ahead. Dozens of vehicles from different eras all crashed together in an impossible tangle of metal and glass. I could see cars from the 1950s crushed against modern SUVs, horse-drawn wagons mixed with futuristic vehicles I didn't recognize, and what appeared to be covered wagons from pioneer days scattered among contemporary traffic. But as I got closer, the accident scene began to shift and change. Sometimes it looked like a current multi-vehicle crash with modern emergency responders and contemporary vehicles. Other times it appeared to be a stagecoach robbery from the Old West, complete with horses in period clothing. Occasionally it looked like a scene from the distant future, with vehicles using technology that didn't exist yet. I realized I was seeing multiple versions of the same location at different points in time, all of them overlapping in the same physical space. Mile marker 163 on Highway 50 was some kind of temporal intersection where past, present, and future accidents were all happening simultaneously. The emergency broadcast crackled back to life as I approached the crash site. Attention all temporal travelers. You are now entering a convergence zone where multiple timeline events are occurring concurrently. Please maintain awareness that your actions may affect past and future occurrences. Do not attempt to interact with displaced persons or objects from other time periods. I drove slowly through the accident scene, watching as emergency responders from different eras worked on the same crash using everything from horse-drawn ambulances to futuristic medical equipment I couldn't identify. None of them seemed to see the others, each group operating as if they were the only people present at their particular version of the emergency. As I passed mile marker 184, the radio suddenly returned to normal programming. classic rock from a station in Reno, clear as day. The traffic around me disappeared, leaving me alone on the empty highway. My CB radio crackled back to life with normal trucker chatter from drivers hundreds of miles away. My satellite phone showed full signal strength again. I pulled over at the next rest area and tried to process what I'd experienced. When I researched Highway 50 later, I found records of major accidents at mile marker 163 dating back to the 1800s. Stagecoach crashes, early automobile accidents, modern traffic pileups. The location seemed to be a natural collision point where different forms of transportation had been meeting disaster for over a century. I completed my delivery to Denver without further incident, but I've never driven that stretch of Highway 50 at night again. During daylight hours, mile marker 163 looks like any other point on the highway. Just empty desert with a historical marker noting that the area was once part of the Pony Express route. But I still monitor radio frequencies when I'm driving through remote areas, listening for emergency broadcasts that announce problems with reality itself. Sometimes I hear them, warnings about temporal disturbances, advisories for drivers traveling between different time periods, emergency alerts for situations that exist only in the spaces where past and future intersect on the endless highways of America. I think some places act as temporal crossroads where all the journeys that have ever been taken or ever will be taken converge into the same physical space. Maybe Highway 50 through Nevada is one of those places where the loneliness of the desert creates conditions that allow different times to bleed together, where emergency broadcasts from multiple eras overlap in the static-filled darkness, warning travelers about dangers that span centuries and disasters that echo across time. My name is Robert Hayes, and I've been driving trucks across the American highways for 24 years. I've run every major route from coast to coast, hauled every type of freight imaginable, and I thought I understood the unwritten rules of the road. The courtesies between drivers, the way convoys form naturally when trucks travel together for safety and companionship. But what happened on Interstate 40 through the Texas Panhandle last August challenged everything I believed about the brotherhood of the road and the bonds that connect drivers across the vast distances of this country. I was westbound from Oklahoma City to Flagstaff, running solo with a load of furniture that wasn't particularly time-sensitive. It was around midnight when I noticed a group of trucks ahead of me, all traveling together in a loose convoy formation. Nothing unusual about that. Drivers often band together on long, empty stretches of highway, especially at night when the roads can be dangerous and lonely. As I caught up to the convoy, I could see there were 6 trucks total, all different makes and models but traveling at the same steady speed with proper spacing between vehicles. Their running lights created a beautiful pattern against the dark Texas landscape, and I felt that familiar sense of camaraderie that comes from sharing the road with other professional drivers. I settled in behind the last truck in the convoy, a red Peterbilt pulling a flatbed trailer. The driver seemed to notice me joining the group because he flashed his marker lights in the traditional greeting. I flashed mine back, and just like that, I was part of the convoy, the 7th truck in a line of professional drivers helping each other navigate the long night ahead. For the next hour, we traveled together in perfect formation. The lead truck would signal lane changes for the entire group. The middle trucks would relay CB communications up and down the line, and the rear trucks would watch for four-wheelers trying to break up the convoy. It was textbook convoy behavior, the kind of coordinated driving that makes the highways safer for everyone. But as we continued west, I started noticing things that didn't quite make sense. The other trucks never seemed to need fuel stops, even though we'd been traveling for hours. When I tried to raise them on the CB radio, I got responses, but the voices sounded hollow and distant, like they were being transmitted from very far away. Convoy leader to all units, we've got construction ahead at mile marker 247. Single-lane traffic for the next 5 miles. Maintain spacing and watch for flaggers. The voice was professional, experienced, but there was something ethereal about it that made me uncomfortable. When we reached mile marker 247, there was indeed construction, exactly as the convoy leader had warned. But the construction zone looked strange. The equipment was older than what I expected to see. The barriers were a different style from current standards, and the flaggers were wearing hard hats and safety vests that looked like they were from decades past. As we passed through the construction zone in single file, I got a better look at the other trucks in the convoy. They were all models from the 1970s and 80s, beautifully maintained but clearly vintage vehicles. The Peterbilt ahead of me had styling details I hadn't seen on newer trucks, and when I looked more carefully at the other vehicles, I realized they were all classic models from the golden age of trucking. "This is Big Jim in the blue Kenworth," came a voice over the CB. "Been running this route for 37 years, and I've never seen construction work done this fast. They must be using some new techniques." But as we cleared the construction zone and resumed normal formation, I looked back in my mirrors. The construction area was gone, not just inactive, completely absent, as if it had never existed. The highway stretched behind us, smooth and uninterrupted, with no signs of recent work, no equipment, no evidence that we'd just driven through a construction zone. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe the construction was temporary. Maybe the equipment had been moved quickly to another location. But the complete absence of any trace seemed impossible for such an extensive operation. Around 2 in the morning, the convoy leader announced a fuel stop at a truck plaza ahead. All units were taking fuel at the Desert Rose Travel Center, exit 203. Standard 20-minute stop for fuel and facilities. I was grateful for the break, as my own fuel gauge was getting low and I needed coffee to stay alert. But when we reached exit 203, there was no travel center, no fuel stop, no services of any kind. Just an empty exit ramp that led to a county road disappearing into the darkness. The other trucks in the convoy took the exit anyway, their taillights disappearing down the ramp as if they were following a route only they could see. I stayed on the interstate, confused and increasingly concerned about what I was witnessing. Within minutes, the convoy reformed ahead of me, all 6 trucks back on the highway as if they'd never taken the exit. Their fuel gauges should have been critically low by now, but they showed no signs of distress or need for services. "Convoy leader to all units, excellent fuel stop, clean facilities, good coffee, friendly staff. Ready to resume westbound travel." The voice sounded satisfied, like someone who just completed a successful transaction at a truck stop that didn't exist. As dawn approached, I realized I'd been traveling with ghost trucks, phantom drivers who were following routes that existed only in their memory, stopping at truck stops that had closed decades ago, navigating construction zones that had been completed before I was even born. They were still running the roads they'd always run, still maintaining the schedules they'd always kept, still helping each other through the long nights, even though their own journeys had ended years ago. When the sun came up, the convoy began to fade, not disappearing suddenly, but gradually becoming more transparent, more ghostly, until they were just suggestions of trucks on the horizon. The last transmission I heard was from Big Jim. "Thanks for running with us tonight, driver. Safe travels, and remember that the road goes on forever even when the drivers don't." I completed my delivery to Flagstaff alone, but I've never forgotten that night when I was welcomed into a convoy of drivers who refused to let death end their journey. Since then, I've heard stories from other truckers about similar experiences. Phantom convoys that appear on long, lonely highways, ghostly drivers who still maintain the brotherhood of the road even from beyond. Sometimes, when I'm driving alone through the dark hours before dawn, I look for those familiar patterns of running lights, Listen for CB chatter from voices that sound like they're calling from across decades. I know that somewhere out there the eternal convoy is still running, still helping drivers navigate the darkness, still proving that some bonds between travelers are stronger than the distance between life and death. The highway brotherhood doesn't end when the driving stops. It just moves to different frequencies, different wavelengths, different dimensions of the same endless road that connects all of us who've chosen to spend our lives moving freight across the vast distances of America, whether we're still breathing or just still traveling. My name is Catherine Walsh, and I've been driving commercial vehicles for 18 years, mostly regional routes through the southeastern states where I know every mile of highway like the lines in my own hand. I've seen hundreds of roadside memorials over the years. Those small crosses and flower arrangements that mark spots where people lost their lives in traffic accidents. They're sobering reminders of how dangerous our work can be, silent testimonials to the fragility of life on America's highways. But the memorial I encountered on Highway 321 through rural South Carolina last October was different from all the others. And what happened there still haunts my dreams 6 months later. I was running a late delivery of medical supplies from Charlotte to Savannah, taking back roads to avoid interstate construction that would have put me hours behind schedule. Highway 321 cuts through some of the most remote areas of South Carolina. Dense forests, abandoned farmland, and stretches where you can drive for 30 minutes without seeing another vehicle or any signs of human habitation. Around 11 at night, my headlights caught something white beside the road ahead. As I got closer, I could see it was a roadside memorial, a simple white wooden cross surrounded by artificial flowers with what appeared to be a small metal plaque at the base. I'd passed thousands of similar memorials over the years, but something about this one made me slow down and take a closer look. The cross was immaculately maintained with fresh white paint that seemed to glow in my headlights. The flowers looked new, arranged with care and attention to detail that suggested someone visited this memorial regularly. But we were in the middle of nowhere, at least 20 miles from the nearest town, on a road that carried very little traffic even during daylight hours. I pulled over onto the narrow shoulder to get a better look, thinking maybe I could read the plaque and understand what had happened at this location. As I climbed out of my cab, I noticed that the memorial wasn't just well maintained. It was perfect, like it had been placed there moments before I arrived. The metal plaque was clearly readable in my flashlight beam. In memory of Catherine Walsh, beloved wife and mother, lost on this spot October 15, 2023. The road goes on, but the journey ends. Below the inscription was a small photograph of a woman who looked exactly like me. Same face, same hair, same expression I'd seen in my own driver's license photo. My hands started shaking as I read the plaque again, hoping I'd misunderstood something, hoping the name was similar but not identical to mine. But there was no mistake. This memorial was dedicated to Catherine Walsh, and the photograph was definitely me, despite the fact that I was standing there very much alive reading my own memorial beside a highway in rural South Carolina. I checked the date again, October 15, 2023. That was exactly 1 year ago, to the day. I'd been driving this same route that night, carrying a similar load of medical supplies, running behind the same schedule that had brought me here tonight. I remembered that trip clearly because I'd had mechanical problems that forced me to pull over several times, including a stop right around this location. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, I heard the sound of an approaching truck. Headlights appeared in the distance coming from the direction I'd just traveled. The truck was moving fast, too fast for the narrow, winding highway. I watched as it approached the curve just before the memorial, and I could see it was going to run wide, maybe cross the center line or slide off the shoulder. The truck was a white Freightliner hauling a medical supply trailer, identical to my own rig. As it passed under a streetlight, I could see the driver clearly through the windshield. It was me. The same face, the same clothes I was wearing, the same look of concentration I recognized from catching glimpses of myself in windows and mirrors. I watched myself drive past at dangerous speed, watched my own truck disappear around the next curve. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of screeching brakes, then the terrible crash of metal and glass that meant a vehicle had left the roadway at high speed. I ran back to my truck and drove quickly toward the sound of the accident, expecting to find wreckage, maybe my own truck rolled over in the ditch or wrapped around a tree. But when I reached the curve where the crash should have occurred, there was nothing. No accident, no debris, no evidence that any vehicle had lost control at that location. I drove back to the memorial, which was still there exactly as I'd found it, still marking the spot where Catherine Walsh had supposedly died exactly 1 year ago. But now I understood what had happened. I had died on this road at this location on October 15th, 2023. Whatever I was experiencing now, this night, this delivery, this moment of standing beside my own memorial, was some kind of echo. A repetition of events that had already reached their conclusion. I got back in my truck and continued toward Savannah, completing the delivery that had killed me 1 year ago. Everything proceeded normally. The customer signed for the medical supplies. I got my delivery confirmation. I even stopped for coffee at a truck stop outside the city. But as dawn broke and I started the return trip, I began to fade, becoming more transparent with each mile. By the time I reached Highway 321 again, I could barely see my own hands on the steering wheel. My truck was becoming ghostly, insubstantial, like a photograph that was slowly losing its color. As I passed the memorial for the second time, I felt a tremendous sense of peace, like I was finally understanding something important about the nature of time, memory, and the roads we travel. I think some journeys are so important, so necessary, that we continue making them even after they've ended. Maybe the medical supplies I delivered that night saved someone's life. And the universe needed that delivery to happen, needed Catherine Walsh to complete that run, even though Catherine Walsh had died trying to make it on time. I still drive Highway 321 sometimes, but only as an observer now. Only as a memory of motion along a road that leads from nowhere to nowhere. Other drivers pass through that memorial without seeing it, without knowing that someone just like them lost everything trying to deliver cargo that seemed important at the time. But the memorial is there, marking the spot where dedication to the job became dedication to something larger, where the final delivery became the first step into whatever comes next for drivers who refuse to abandon their routes even when the driving is done. I've been driving these Nevada highways for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the desert could throw at me. Heat mirages that make the asphalt dance like water, dust storms that turn day into night, and the kind of isolation that makes you question your own sanity. But nothing prepared me for what I saw in my mirrors on that Tuesday afternoon in October. It started innocently enough. I was hauling a load of electronics from Reno to Las Vegas, the kind of routine run I could do in my sleep. The sun was high, the road was straight, and my CB was picking up nothing but static. That's when I first noticed it in my side mirror. Another 18-wheeler, same make and model as mine, following about a quarter-mile back. White Peterbilt with a blue stripe just like mine. Even the trailer looked identical down to the scratches on the aluminum sides. At first I figured it was just coincidence. There are plenty of similar rigs on the road, and drivers tend to stick together on long hauls. But as the miles rolled by, something started to feel off. When I adjusted my speed, the truck adjusted too. When I changed lanes, it changed lanes. When I hit my turn signal, I swear I saw its blinker flash at the exact same moment. I tried to get a better look by adjusting my mirrors, but every time I did, the truck seemed to shift just enough to stay in that perfect following position. The distance between us never changed, not by a foot, not by an inch. It was like we were connected by an invisible tether, two trucks moving in perfect synchronization across the desert floor. The paranoia started creeping in around mile marker 127. I decided to test my theory. I tapped my brakes. Nothing dramatic, just enough to flash my brake lights. In my mirror, I watched the other truck's lights flash at the exact same instant. Not a second later, not a heartbeat behind, but simultaneously, as if we shared the same electrical system. My hands started to sweat on the steering wheel. I reached for my CB radio, but before I could key the mic, I saw the driver in the mirror truck do the same thing. My blood ran cold. I slowly moved my hand away from the radio and watched the other driver's hand move in perfect unison. I had to pull over. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and I needed to see this thing with my own eyes, not through the distorted reflection of a mirror. I found a wide spot on the shoulder and eased my rig to a stop, watching in fascination and terror as the mirror truck came to a halt at the exact same moment. I set my parking brake, grabbed my baseball cap, and climbed down from the cab. The desert air hit me like a furnace, but I barely noticed. I walked to the back of my trailer, then beyond it, looking down the empty highway behind me. Nothing. Just heat shimmer and endless asphalt stretching to the horizon. No truck, no tire marks, no dust cloud. Nothing to indicate another vehicle had been there at all. But when I walked back to my cab and climbed in, there it was again in my mirror. The white Peterbilt with the blue stripe sitting motionless on the shoulder, its driver visible as a dark silhouette behind the windshield. I waved my hand, and the shadow waved back. I tried everything I could think of over the next 100 miles. I sped up to 90 and it kept pace. I slowed to 40 and it matched my speed exactly. I took an exit ramp, and it followed me down, staying in the mirrors but never appearing in my direct line of sight. When I got back on the highway, it was still there like a faithful dog that would never leave my side. The worst part was when I stopped for fuel in Tonopah. I pulled up to the diesel pumps, and through my passenger mirror I watched the mirror truck pull up to pumps that didn't exist on the other side of the station. I could see the driver getting out, moving in perfect synchronization with my own movements, filling a tank that cast no shadow under the harsh fluorescent lights. That was 6 hours ago. I'm writing this at a truck stop outside Vegas, and it's still there in my mirror, parked exactly where my truck would be if someone had created a perfect reflection of this entire parking lot. I've been sitting here for an hour, afraid to start my engine, afraid to look away from the mirrors, afraid of what happens when I reach my destination. Because I'm starting to realize something that makes my skin crawl. I'm not being followed by a mirror truck. I am the mirror truck. The call came in at 11:47 p.m., just as I was settling into my bunk at the Flying J outside Toledo. Emergency delivery, they said. Rush job to Detroit, and the pay was too good to refuse. $3,000 cash for a single pallet delivered by dawn. No questions asked, no paperwork beyond a signature. In 23 years of driving, I'd learned that the weird jobs paid the best. So I fired up my rig and headed into the night. The address they gave me was in Detroit's industrial district, a part of the city I'd avoided for years. Most of the factories had been shuttered since the recession, leaving behind a wasteland of broken windows and rusted metal. But GPS is GPS, and mine was leading me deeper into the maze of abandoned streets with mechanical certainty. The pallet itself was unremarkable, just a wooden crate about the size of a washing machine, wrapped in black plastic and secured with metal bands. No shipping labels, no hazmat warnings, nothing to indicate what was inside. It weighed maybe 200 pounds, and when I'd loaded it at the warehouse, the forklift operator wouldn't meet my eyes. He just handed me the delivery receipt and walked away without a word. I should have looked at that receipt more carefully before I left, but I was focused on the road and the promise of easy money. It wasn't until I was rolling through the empty streets of Detroit that I glanced at the paperwork clipped to my visor. The delivery date made me do a double take. March 15th, 2075. 51 years in the future. I figured it was a typo, maybe someone had mixed up the digits, but something cold settled in my stomach anyway. The GPS led me down increasingly narrow streets past buildings that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. Broken streetlights created pools of darkness between the occasional working lamp, and my headlights illuminated nothing but empty lots filled with weeds and debris. When the computerized voice told me I'd reached my destination, I found myself staring at a pile of rubble where a building should have been. The demolition looked recent, maybe a few months old, but the concrete chunks were already being reclaimed by vegetation. A chain-link fence surrounded the lot, and a faded sign read "Future Site of Detroit Renaissance Complex." I sat there idling, wondering if I'd been sent on some kind of wild goose chase, when I saw a figure emerge from behind a concrete pillar that shouldn't have been able to hide anyone. He was an older man, maybe 60, wearing a clean business suit that seemed impossibly out of place in the rubble. He walked toward my truck with purpose, as if he'd been expecting me, and gestured for me to back up to what had once been a loading dock but was now just a raised concrete slab. I should have driven away right then, but something compelled me to follow his directions. The unloading went smoothly enough. The man had a hand truck ready, and together we maneuvered the crate off my trailer. He examined it carefully, running his hands along the metal bands, then nodded with satisfaction. When he reached into his jacket, I expected a clipboard or paperwork, but instead he pulled out a thick envelope filled with cash. Crisp hundreds, exactly $3,000. He asked me to sign the delivery receipt, and when I handed it back to him, he smiled for the first time. It wasn't a pleasant expression. There was something hungry about it, something that made me want to get back in my truck and drive as fast as possible. He thanked me for my service and said something about how difficult it was to find reliable drivers these days, though the way he said it made me think he meant something different by these days. I was back on the highway within 10 minutes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The city looked different in my mirrors, brighter somehow, with more lights in the windows and less decay visible in the buildings. When I stopped at a gas station, the attendant looked at me strangely when I tried to pay with the cash from the envelope. That's when I discovered the bills were turning to ash in my wallet. Not burning, not crumbling, just becoming fine gray dust that scattered when I touched it. By morning, there was nothing left but empty space where $3,000 had been. I called the company that had hired me, but the number was disconnected. The warehouse where I'd picked up the load was empty, with a for lease sign that looked like it had been there for years. The security footage from the delivery site, when I finally worked up the courage to look, showed my truck backing up to the ruined loading dock. It showed me opening the trailer and setting up my lift gate. But in the grainy black and white video, I was working alone, unloading an invisible crate for a client who cast no shadow, handing my receipt to empty air. I've been trying to figure out what happened that night, but every lead turns to ash, just like the money. All I know for certain is that I made a delivery to an address that doesn't exist, for a client who shouldn't have been there, on a date that hasn't happened yet, and sometimes late at night when I'm driving empty highways. I wonder if I ever really left that demolished building at all.